Tendope was a series of pivots. There were quite a various journeys to get to 5 million ARR. I guess what allowed us to unlock our hyper growth before we sold the business was.
Can you tell us how you scaled Tendope to 5 million ARR? Can you break down the key growth levers that helped make the most impact?
Yeah, so Tendope was a series of pivots. There were quite a various journeys to get to 5 million ARR. I guess what allowed us to unlock our hyper growth before we sold the business was creating a lot of content for our ICP. So really defining who our ICP was, where they lived, and creating a lot of value so that when we would reach out to them, we were not completely out of the blue and cold, and they had heard of us before. And so they were open to listening to what we had to say. In our case, our ICP were HR leaders in the Philippines. So we wrote a lot of content on LinkedIn. And when I say we, me, my team, the co-founders and the sales team, we were just writing a lot of information that they might consume. And then when we would do outreach, they had engaged with our content or at least read some of our articles, and they were open to talking to us. And that helped open a lot of doors as before we were doing a lot of cold outreach. And as those, they're not that effective when people have no idea who you are. The likeliness of them opening your email or your text is very low.
So, in terms of the content creation, was that before you built the startup or after?
No, this came way later. Initially, first of all, we were a B2C business. So we were doing more traditional digital marketing to acquire our customers. And when we decided to pivot to B2B, the traditional cold email and cold calling approaches were not working as well. So we had to come up with creative ways to get our audience's attention. And so one of the ways was like the content creation on LinkedIn. But another one that we developed, and this became a playbook of mine, which I use for my coaching business and that I'm going to use for my startup coming up, is creating sort of an industry podcast where as a side to your business, you create a podcast, which could be co-branded or completely separately branded from your business. And the goal is to talk about something interesting for your ICP. So, in the case of Tendope, we created a podcast about HR trends, what's new in HR, things that would be relevant to our ICP. And then we would reach out to all of our ICP, our ideal customers, and ask them to feature on our podcast. And a lot of people are excited to be on a podcast, especially if it's their first time or if they want to get a bit of exposure. So it was very easy for us to get them on our podcast, spend 30, 40 minutes talking to them about industry trends and build a relationship with them. And then all of a sudden we had a relationship we could leverage and turn into a potential sale. So those became avenues for us to build our client list, or at least our sales pipeline.
Oh, definitely. So, LinkedIn and podcasting.
Absolutely.
So, tell us a bit about your new startup, Kubergrades. How does this company manage and upgrade their clusters efficiently?
So QGrade is a brand new startup. So I've been working on it for less than 2 months, depending on when you're listening to this. So let's say the last 2 months of 2024. And as you mentioned, it's a development tool that allows companies that are running on Kubernetes to manage and upgrade their clusters a lot more efficiently. It's a completely new world for me because I've come from FinTech, and prior to that, I was at AdTech. And this project came to fruition when I met one of my close friends who has been in the DevOps world for 15 years, and in particular in Kubernetes for 10 years. And he's been solving problems for his clients in a DevOps agency for the longest time. And he came to the realization that internally he had built this tool that was helping him save 70% of his team's time, solving specifically the upgrade process of clusters. And he came to me and said he wanted to turn it into a product as opposed to just keep doing it in his agency. And I was looking for a new project at the time. I had been consulting and coaching founders for a year or so. And we decided to turn it into a product. We decided to talk to a bunch of different CTOs in Southeast Asia as well as in North America to see if the problem that he had been solving was indeed a problem other companies had. And we came to the realization that many companies who are large, running multiple clusters, usually 15 or more clusters, do a lot of manual work when it comes to upgrading their clusters. And so this product had legs. Then we started talking to investors in my network there was a great interest for this type of project. It's a B2B SaaS in enterprise. It's solving a very narrow but deep sort of problem, which is exciting because it creates a moat around your startup. So that's when we started, and that's how it works. I can't even get into too much detail about the solution itself because I'm not a technical founder, but it's a very big problem for most enterprises that run on Kubernetes.
Definitely. It sounds very interesting. So I think something that you said really sparked something. You talked about how you spoke to CTOs before you decided to raise funding. I think a lot of first time founders, they miss this point and they just start building. What do you have to say to them?
Of course, people get excited and they want to start doing things as soon as possible. I'm a big believer in idea validation, which is pre-MVP. People kind of skip that and go into MVP because they've read the lean startup and books like these, and people say, build an MVP and go try it with your clients. I prefer a slightly longer validation period where it can be conversations, it can be surveys, it can even be a landing page that you run advertising on and see whether or not people are going to be clicking on your links and things like that. And this type of validation, I did it for TendoPay before, where I'm not going to get into too much detail, but essentially at the time, our idea was to be a buy now, pay later. So an installment plan. And all we did was create a fake e-commerce website selling a pair of sneakers, adding two buttons. One is buy now and the other one is buy on installments at a fraction of the price. And then we ran some ads towards that landing page, saw that people preferred clicking on the buy on installments, and we've managed to validate the idea. And then we kept adding more and more experiments, but I'm a big believer in that type of thing. So in this case for KubeGrade, the thing is my co-founder had solved this problem for his agency. So he knew some clients were interested. I just wanted to expand my understanding of how big of a problem that was for companies. And that's why I contacted a dozen CTOs in my LinkedIn network, asked them if they were using Kubernetes. And once they agreed to speak to me, I identified the problem that we were trying to solve. If they agreed that they did have the problem, that kind of gave me a green light to go ahead. And most of them did. And I figured out that it only happened at a certain level of enterprise size, meaning once they were running a certain number of clusters. And that kind of gave me a lot of information about who my future clients would be as well. So yeah, I'm a big believer in this type of validation. And I think every founder should try to spend more time on it rather than jumping towards building something immediately.
And how do you ensure that the questions you ask are not leading questions? For example, do you think this is a good idea? Or so, how do you make sure that it's very neutral?
Don't talk about the solution at all. Ask them problem-specific questions. So, okay, so you guide them somewhere you want them to go, meaning they cannot be completely open-ended. But in our case, the question would start with, are you guys running Kubernetes? Okay, cool. How many Kubernetes clusters do you run? Okay, cool. Like, how long have you been running them? And the question about how long have you been running them is because we know that the dev tool that we're building is for what we call in development day 2 operations, meaning not onboarding, but down the line maintenance. And day 2 is missing. It's not the right word because the reality is that only happens 6 to 12 months after you've been running Kubernetes. But the idea was to say, okay, how long have you been running it? Oh, we've been running Kubernetes for 12 months. Okay, have you started noticing any issues running Kubernetes? Like, are there things that break? Are there things that annoy you? Are there problems that your team has to solve on a daily basis? And if the answer is yes or no, we dig deeper into what those problems might be. So it's never leading towards our solution, but it's more seeing if they get to that aha moment of, yes, we do have that problem. And then we realize that we can solve it for them. So yeah, you never want to have loaded questions. That's the wrong way to do it.
So asking questions bit by bit, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Having a conversational flow, and you don't need to go interview style. You follow how they respond to things and try to go with the flow.
So what's a counterintuitive lesson about growing a SaaS startup in Southeast Asia that most founders tend to overlook?
So I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but there are two things that are difficult for SaaS in Southeast Asia. The first thing is that labor is pretty cheap, right? So most companies will think that they can do whatever your SaaS does by hiring people at a fraction of the price of North America or Europe. And therefore, they don't always see the need to pay for software because it's still very affordable to do pretty much any sort of task with labor. And people are used to labor, they're not used to technology as much. It's changing, but it's slow to change. The second thing is payment methods are not the same as in North America and Europe. So corporations very rarely have credit cards. And so paying for SaaS, you have to go through like regular invoicing, payment terms, bank transfers, and that's sort of counterintuitive for a foreign founder to have to come to realize that. It's very hard. And it's something that you really have to adapt to if you want to work with in Southeast Asia.
Definitely. I think I definitely see those two being a case. I think I've used SaaS software that have really complicated billing. I had to call someone to pay for the product. And I think it's great because you get that direct customer feedback, but it is also less scalable.
Yeah, I agree. And it's very frustrating sometimes when Southeast Asian SaaS specifically, they don't display pricing. They make you go through like salespeople. It's a bit old school.
So for non-technical founders, what are the top 3 systems or tools you'd recommend for building and scaling a startup effectively?
Give me 1 sec. We'll redo that question. It just needs to sneeze.
Sure. So for non-technical founders, what are the top 3 systems or tools that you'd recommend for building and scaling a startup effectively?
Yeah. So non-technical founders these days have the chance of having ChatGPT. So first of all, being able to code an MVP of some sort with ChatGPT or other LLMs is one of the biggest sort of benefits of 2024, I would say. But if I had to list 3, it would really be mostly just focusing on using any type of SaaS out there that allows you to do what you'd like to do. Because back then I always needed a co-founder to build things that I had ideas for, but now I can just literally look for any sort of tool that I'm looking for. And pretty much anything you're trying to do is built into a SaaS or a product or mostly through LLMs. So now I have a very technical product. So I do need a co-founder that is, sort of in that industry. But any other product that I wanted to build, or if I wanted to build a micro SaaS or an e-commerce or anything like that, I would simply just use an LLM as my co-pilot or as my co-founder and ask him what tools I can leverage other than that ChatGPT or other LLM, and just work with that and just use it as your second screen is always open, and any question you have, you just ask them. Because at the end of the day, you can really build a lot on your own these days by using ChatGPT as your co-founder.
Completely agree. How do you ensure if you're both the technical and the non-technical founder at the same time that you don't make the mistake of just building the product?
You mean building too early or just building something people don't need?
Focusing too much on building and too little on feedback, but just being too excited about
Yeah.
AI.
Yeah, it's happened a lot. And it's a similar question to what we talked about earlier, is people building too quickly without validating that there's a problem. I think it's interesting to build slow and iterate. And every time you build something, make sure you have a potential client in mind that you can test it with. Or even better than this, and this is what we're doing with CubeGrade, is that we've identified a certain number of potential clients that are really targeted for us. And we're essentially having them as part of our team and telling them that, hey, we want to build this solution that really caters to your need. And you're essentially a development partner of ours. And that could be for any type of product you're building, saying, really involving a potential client in the build process, whether you pay them or you give them a discount on your products in the future, or just they want to feel involved. Being able to build this with a potential client helps you understand their mindset, what they're really looking for. And I think that puts you ahead rather than you as the founder just building whatever you have in your mind and forgetting about your customers and how they think and what they're looking for. So building with your clients and iterating and building slowly, I think is a lot more valuable than rushing to build something that's in your mind and then hoping that someone will need it or that it will fit what people are looking for.
slowly and iterating based on. So you've mentioned your focus on delivering maximum value to clients. What frameworks or strategies did you use to ensure this at scale?
Yeah, it's tough to do at scale. And I like that question because startups are always looking for maximum scale. And my vision is bringing maximum value and caring for my clients and really spending time with them. So those almost sound like contradictory sort of philosophies. But the best way to do it is really focusing on sort of a customer success team. And a lot of companies have sales teams and then maybe customer support team. But the customer success team is becoming more and more popular as a concept. And it's really the team that will nurture your clients to either make sure that they don't churn or to increase their ACV by providing additional services or products. And to me, that customer success team is one of the most important components because you really show them that they're valuable, you provide max value. And at the end of the day, they will want to stay with you and give you as much money as they can give you if you provide more services or products to them. So in order to scale properly, build a really strong customer success team.
Definitely. I completely agree. But in the beginning, I guess the customer success team would just be the founder,
Absolutely.
essentially.
The founder should work extended hours and be as close to the business, as close to the clients, and as close to everything as possible. So no matter what role you talk about, like right now I'm starting this new company, right? It's just me and my co-founder. No matter how much money we're raising for this product, we will be doing and knowing and touching every part of the company because that's the best way to make sure you don't make mistakes. You know exactly what your customers want or don't want. Any problem that arises, you need to be aware of it. The mistake that a lot of startups do is that they raise a lot of money, then they start hiring for all these different roles, but they don't even know what the company requires because it's a startup, it's unknown. You have to be a part of it and you have to have done every single role to know how to delegate them to someone else, how to hire the right fit for some different roles. So at the beginning, I expect to do everything. And that's what's time consuming is that you want to be everywhere at the same time and you need to be so that you can learn the ins and outs of your business, but you have to take the time to document all of it as well so that you can properly delegate and create SOPs so that when you hire, not only the right candidate, but also what the tasks will be. And then they can bring their own value from their own experiences, but you need to know what the business needs before you can hire for it. And yeah, that's basically my sort of vision of things.
There should be involved in everything so that they can know what to delegate. Otherwise, I think a lot of roles and startups that fail essentially are those that are just created because they raised a lot of funding and they're just going to hire all these roles and then it crashes because they didn't follow the best practices of
Yeah.
startups. Like
They didn't come up with anything that's specific to them. They just expected everyone that got hired to bring their experience, but it's just a big mess and it doesn't work. That happens a lot.
essentially. So what's your approach to balancing growth between B2C and B2B markets? How did this play out at TendoPay?
So we didn't really have to balance it very much because we completely transitioned from B2C to B2B. But I can tell you a little bit about the differences between scaling a B2C and a B2B business. And I'm a very big proponent of B2B business. I much prefer them to B2C. B2C is very easy to acquire customers. If you have a good digital marketing strategy, good content strategy, clients will come. But most of the time, it's very hard to create a product that is very sticky for B2C customers because B2C has finite amount of capital. They want to deploy it for things that really matter and they're willing to try different things. But most B2C companies usually have a big churn problem. And it's what we call a leaky bucket problem, meaning you're able to acquire a lot of leads and customers into a bucket, but it's always leaking and churning. And in my opinion, you can solve it. Obviously, a lot of companies have solved it, but it's a lot easier to do so with B2B companies where acquiring them might be more difficult because they're more sophisticated. They're looking for products that really answer a business needs. So it's not as easy to come up with ideas of businesses. But once you're able to build something that they need and that they can use and that provides them value, they're much more sticky. So their likeliness to churn is a lot lower. And therefore, I much prefer working with those types of clients because you're bringing value, solving a problem, they'll stay for a long time. So acquiring them is difficult, but at least they're here for much longer duration. And that's a type of business that I'm much more interested in.
Completely agree with the B2B over B2C, especially with churn, because with businesses, once they get a software that they like and solves their problem, they continue using it way more than consumers.
That's right.
Like myself, I switched too many SaaS products for
Yeah.
B2C and I feel so guilty for it, but I do like to try new things.
Because it's your hard-earned money as an individual. As a business, you're spending corporate money. And if you build the business case that, hey, if we spend this much money, we're saving this much money or we're making this much money, the corporation will not change that easily. It just makes sense for them.
True. So when looking to grow quickly, what role does networking and building relationships in Southeast Asia play? And how can founders leverage it?
Southeast Asia specifically is very relationship based. And so sometimes signing contracts revolve around building a strong relationship with someone as opposed to proving to them that you have a solid product. Sorry. We'll cut that up. And in Southeast Asia particularly, I like to network with people constantly. I go to every networking event that I can, every conference that I can, write a lot of content on LinkedIn. I do podcasts. And I've noticed that my circle of influence and the people that I've been able to talk to has been much more receptive to what I have to say. So whether I was doing consulting or now I've been doing fundraising, it's been a lot easier to talk to people because I had built such a network or a relationship network. In North America, when I was selling my ad tech services, etc., I could reach out to companies and simply tell them that I had a business model that would help them save X amount of money or generate X amount of sales. And they would listen because it's part of their mandate to grow or to save money or etc. So it didn't matter who I was. They would still listen to my pitch because it's part of their job to listen to pitches that might save them or make them money. And we were able to sign deals just based on my pitch. That's almost impossible in Southeast Asia.
So you would say Southeast Asia, it's relationship over
or over logic.
Yeah.
Which is not a bad thing.
Right.
As long as you know how it works, you can leverage it, but it is very much relationship based. And sometimes it happens that I see companies signing with a product that is inferior just because they have a better relationship with the founder of that company.
That's true. But what do you have to say for founders who are very early stage? And I think one of the YC advice, they actually said that to go to less networking events. So what does this mean? Is it, maybe it's different for Southeast Asia or?
So be selective about the networking events. That's the truth. There are many networking events that are attracting the wrong crowds, just people who are curious, who are, I don't know, like maybe future entrepreneurs, etc. Go to networking events where your ICP lives. So don't go to just random startup events if you're not selling to startup founders, just to make friends. So in my case, I'm going to be selling DevOps tool, a DevOps or development operations tool. I'm going to be going to networking events and conferences where only DevOps people go, because I know that within a very small time frame, I'm going to get exposure to a ton of people who are exactly my potential users, the potential customers. But I'm probably going to go less to just regular startup events, because at a startup event, you might have a lot of interesting people, but maybe only 5% or 10% of them are using Kubernetes. Whereas at a DevOps conference, maybe 80% of them are using, or even more. If I go to KubeCon, which is a Kubernetes conference, 100% of people are most likely using Kubernetes. So that makes sense too. So just be very selective of where you go to network. Don't just take every networking opportunity, because you want to maximize your time, right? Or the value of your time.
Very good advice, because I think there are a lot of Chinese startup events that founders could be going to, which are good, perhaps for fundraising and making friends, but making sure that you go to those events with your ideal customer.
That's the thing. Like, I wrote an article about this a while ago and it was quite popular, is that founders feel that being busy makes them feel like they're accomplished or that they're doing the right thing. I find that it's a fallacy or a trap to want to look busy or want to do something to feel busy. Instead, maybe spend more time thinking about what's really important that you must work on and just focus on that. And maybe you don't work 10 hours a day. It doesn't matter. Just really find what the Pareto law, like 20-80 or 80-20. What is the stuff that brings the most values to your startup? Focus on that. And then if you can fit other things in, do it. But don't fill your calendar with things just for the sake of filling your calendar, because it just makes you look busy, but it doesn't necessarily bring value. We're all guilty of it at some point. We want to look busy to our employees or to our investors or to our colleagues. But honestly, that's just a bad sort of KPI to have meetings or have calls or whatever. Better to just find exactly what maximizes your value and focus on that.
I completely agree. So just focusing on the main things that move the needle. To be honest, like having that kind of space, mental space to think, and it actually helps you become more
I
productive,
agree. I think
not less.
free time, walking time, things like that. For some reason, like when I'm running or when I'm walking or doing other things that are not necessarily in front of my computer, I get really good ideas. And I think you should free up more time to think, because as a founder, like one of your biggest assets is your brain. So let it breathe and let it do its thing as well. So sleep is always important as well. A lot of founders think that they're joining the 5 a.m. club or sleeping a few hours, that makes them super powerful. I think sleeping 8 hours is a superpower because your brain regenerates fully. You can use it at its max capacity and you can last a lot longer.
And great. Also ensures that you don't burn out.
That's what I mean. Yeah, you can last a marathon rather than a sprint.
Definitely. So what are the biggest misconceptions about the Southeast Asian startup ecosystem? And how should founders navigate these challenges?
It's a misconception, but it's also an agenda on the side of the VCs, which is to go after the entire region, to have a regional play, as opposed to focusing on one country and dominating that country. And I understand why VCs push that agenda on founders, because, they want to have a bigger market, bigger number of users, etc. The reality is that being able to do Southeast Asia as a whole very well is very hard. Just moving from one country to another means you have an entire new language, an entire new culture. Everything is different from one country to another, even within country, that whether it's Thailand, maybe less, but like Indonesia has 5 official languages and 100 plus others. Each region is completely different. There are different religions. There are different ways of doing things, different laws. So imagine going from one country to another. It's like creating a brand new startup. And for investors to think that, hey, we're going to invest a bit more now, go to 2 or 3 other countries, it's not that easy. It's more start a completely new company and rethink everything you're doing with their culture, with their way of thinking, with their immersive. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions, is that Southeast Asia is the region. It's not a market itself. It is a region of very fragmented region where every country is completely different, and having a sort of geographic scope or a regional scope has only been achieved by a handful of companies which had billions of dollars to spend.
That I think there's this misconception that if you target a lot of markets, it means that you'll be more successful, but actually it could mean that you are less successful
I
because
agree.
you don't understand your customers. So what was the most challenging moment in scaling your startup, and how did you push through it?
There have been many challenging components, but let's talk about TechnoPay. I think the most challenging was raising money, because it was a fintech and it was a consumer lending fintech, meaning that on the one hand, we had we had raised for our equity, meaning we had money that we could use to burn, as you call it, to spend on employees, on expenses, etc. But on the other hand, we had to lend money to our users. So we had to fundraise debt, which were 2 completely different types of fundraise. But one was usually related to the other, and they were terms that would involve each other. And so the first few rounds were not too hard because we were able to show that we had a business model that worked, etc. But as we started scaling and raising much bigger amounts of money, so let's say we were trying to raise 20 million USD in debt and 5 million USD in equity, those challenges became a lot more apparent, that the terms from each fundraise was really strict and contingent on each other, etc. And basically fundraising was our biggest blocker in terms of scaling. Like we had a business model that was very efficient, that was working, that was profitable. There was a lot of demand. We had figured out the sales cycle or the sales sort of flow. But this fundraising was always slowing us down and taking so much time that eventually that's why we ended up having to sell to Tarnic Bank, because we couldn't fundraise fast enough and our runway was running out. So in lieu of growing a lot faster, and we were going to be able to grow a lot faster due to our track record, we had to sell. And that was the biggest sort of roadblock.
So you said it's because you were in FinTech, but if it was other businesses, would you be able to scale without fundraising?
It was in FinTech and in consumer lending FinTech, meaning we had to loan out money. So extremely cash demanding. There are definitely businesses that require a lot less capital. And actually, many people are able to bootstrap their SaaS or any startups to that matter. And I think that's a really great way to go. If you have, a side project or an idea, I really recommend bootstrapping it. My first 2 businesses were bootstrapped, and that was a lot less stressful. At the end of the day, when I sold them, I retained a lot more ownership. So that's usually an idea that makes a lot more sense. But yeah, essentially, if it's your first startup, especially, don't go chasing fundraising just for the sake of saying that you've fundraised, and don't glorify fundraising. Instead, try to build a business that you can build with the tool that you have, LLMs, bunch of different SaaSes, maybe a co-founder that's a bit more technical than you or more business oriented than you if you're technical, and try to build things that don't require a lot of capital, especially as your first business. Once you have experience, once you understand what it takes to scale, to build, then go after fundraising, because you've already proven to investors that you know how to build, whether or not you sold your first business. That'll give you some sort of track record to prove to investors that they can invest in you. You'll get better valuation, easier fundraising, and things like that. So I would always recommend start without fundraising, but it's not always possible.
Someone who works in the VC space, how about this podcast? And he did say that it's either traction or track record. And I think a lot of founders, they see the people with the track record, but then they assume that as a first-time founder, you won't be able to do that. Like suddenly just raise 40 million in funding. But if you look at their background, they've already built a couple of successful businesses.
Definitely becomes easier to fundraise once you've had some exits.
Definitely. So building relationships is key to your success. What's the most valuable relationship that you've built, and how has this impacted your journey?
Pinpoint most valuable specifically is very hard, but I've built really strong relationships in many fields. So let's say in the investment field, Iterative. Are you familiar with the accelerator Iterative? Yes, in Singapore.
No, actually, could you please explain?
Yeah, so Iterative is YC, but for Southeast Asia. The 2 general partners are from Silicon Valley. They built and sold several businesses. And they were one of the first backers of my previous company, SendoPay. And I kept a relationship with them. And I've helped out a lot of their founders. I've given talks to them. And because of this relationship that we built, they were willing to back me on my next startup. This is someone I'll be working with for my new project. And this is a relationship that's been going on for 5 years that we've been maintaining. And but of having that relationship in the investment world has been interesting. I've had many relationships in business as well that either I can leverage to make introductions or ask for guidance, mentorship, etc. But I can't pinpoint a specific one relationship. It's just a network of people that I like to stay in touch with. And I spend a lot of time on my WhatsApp, kind of scrolling down in history and looking at people I haven't spoken with in a while and just getting back in touch, etc. So it's very demanding, but I like to stay in touch with hundreds of people, trying to go to coffees, lunches, etc. when it's relevant. So overall relationships, super important. Pinpointing one specific one, very hard.
I love that. I love that you scroll down your WhatsApp, keep in touch with people. Because I think as a founder, it can be really hard to keep in touch with people,
It's
essentially.
very hard and it's time consuming. I wish there was an AI to go through my entire history and start a conversation with random people based on our chat history. If someone's
That's an
listening, they
idea for
could build
you.
that.
But would your friends know that it's an AI?
With natural sounding LLMs, I think they would just go through the history and pick up where we left off. I don't think they'd know that I'll train them on my tone and language.
But what if your friend listens to this podcast?
If you're listening, it wasn't me.
So if you could go back and tell yourself one thing before starting TendoPay, what would it be and why?
It's going to sound dumb, but I would tell myself, don't do FinTech. Don't do consumer lending. There's way too much compliance, red tape, working with the central banks, with the lenders, with the investors. It's a real hassle. It was exciting at the time, and FinTech is the multiples are very high if you have a good exit, etc. So it's tempting. But I would tell myself, focus on something that you're more familiar with and something that has a lot less red tape. Like you don't have to deal with so many different sort of institutions and laws and red tape. It's just a nightmare. So that's my advice to myself 7, 8 years ago.
So don't focus on FinTech unless you build your first startup in FinTech.
Unless you're an
want to build
expert in
another one.
FinTech and unless you love compliance and things like that, it's just not my cup of tea. And I was excited about the prospect of growing. It has the mass appeal, but it's very complicated and too much can go wrong.
This is a great place to finish off the podcast. Thank you so much for giving all of your valuable advice to our listeners. I'm sure they've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Panida. I appreciate you inviting me on the show. It was fun.
Thank you.